Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. We're diving right in this time with an item that I mentioned in the last episode. Blood impurity. A repulsive thing that the blood relatives of Cainhurst, hunters of blood, are said to find within human death blood. Addicts of the dying will of blood, that is to say, hunters in particular, are said to be more likely to harbor them. Therefore, they hunt hunters, and Queen Annalise likely sips the impurities offered to her. All for the dearest desire of the blood relatives, to hold a child of blood within those arms. As you can see, there's a lot to talk about here, but before we get into it, I just want to briefly mention that I won't be discussing the name of this next boss in any detail, because it's already come up twice. You can hear more than you probably ever wanted to about almonds, brain regions, and this boss name by going back to episodes 24 and 27 of Translationborne. So, to return to the subject of blood dregs, the first thing I want to note is that we appear to have run across another item with a significant discrepancy between the official English text and the Japanese. In the original, it says that the dearest desire of the Vilebloods is to hold a child of blood within those arms. There is no mention, as there is in the official English text, of Queen Annalise bearing a child of blood, at least not in the sense of giving birth to one, let alone that this child would constitute the Vileblood heir. Similar to what I've said before, though, I'm skeptical of this information being made up. What seems most likely to me, and what also seems in line with the sorts of discrepancies we've seen before, is that this is actually a remnant from an earlier translation of an older version of this item. Unfortunately, going through the cut content available in David Christie's Lore Translation Guide doesn't yield any direct evidence of this, as was the case with Ludwig's weapons and the Kirkhammer. But there is some interesting circumstantial evidence to suggest an earlier version of this item existed that's interesting in its own right. It seems that there was an unused type of blood called queenly blood that you were meant to receive from Annalise, similar to how you can get the blood of Adela and the blood of Ariana in the current version of the game. Here, where the English description makes reference to blood dregs, the corresponding item name in the Japanese is not Chino Kegare, it's Chino Se, or possibly Chino Sho, as I'm not entirely sure which pronunciation would apply in this circumstance. Anyway, this would seem to indicate that at one point, the Japanese name of the item offered up to Annalise that you earned from killing hunters was changed. If true, that could mean that an earlier version of the Japanese text from when this item was still called Chino Se did mention childbirth explicitly, and did reference a Vileblood heir. It's just that for whatever reason, the official English text still reflects that. Given the numerous other items that seem to have suffered from similar sorts of issues, this only seems more likely to me. But whether or not that's true, I still think this change in name is worth considering in its own right. That's because while the kanji for se has a lot of meanings, mostly pertaining to some manner of life force, the fifth sense listed in my Daijisen Japanese dictionary is a synonym for semen, which if you look closely at the art for the Blood Dreg, I think you'll find is a connection that was meant to be drawn. This set of meanings, referencing both a life force and seminal fluid, then leads to more connections. Remember that these items are found in the blood of hunters, who are described as addicts of the dying will of blood. So it could be that taking on lingering wills that have persevered beyond death allows a certain manner of life force to take root in the blood of hunters. This life force is then harvested by the Vilebloods and brought to their queen, who seeks to use its generative properties to conceive a child of blood. Of course, ultimately that item name was changed, and this connection was obscured. This could have been for any number of reasons. Maybe the developers wanted to emphasize the impurity of the Vilebloods, which didn't match up well with the connotations of purity that this kanji also contains. Maybe it wasn't in line with the ultimate vision for where the story was going to go, because from what I understand, Bloodborne's story went through a lot of changes from the point when it was initially conceived to when it was finally released. Or maybe it was for some other reason entirely. But whatever those reasons were, the Japanese became Chino Kegare, and quite possibly some of the wording was rearranged as well. But I don't want to finish looking at this item without going over some of the text that does make it through unaffected by this discrepancy. Specifically, I wanted to mention how much I love the term echo-fiends in comparison to the more literal addicts of the dying will of blood. It's highly succinct, and I think it succeeds in being a comprehensible English language reference to those addicted to blood echoes. What's more, it does a great job of adding somewhat malicious connotations to the work of a hunter, defamiliarizing something that gameplay has by now made routine, which I think is entirely in line with the expectations of the original. It also subtly gets at what I think is a bit of an ongoing theme of the Soulsborne games, which is that the very source of strength that lets you stand against your enemies is questionable, and relying on it may change you for the worse. Speaking of which, why don't we check in with Gilbert and see how he's doing? Last time, he seemed pretty rough.
Why me? Why? Dear gods, what have I done? Save me. Please, save me.
Maybe I should go. Right, we'll leave him to it. But in the meantime, while there wasn't much actual text here, that just gives us an opportunity to look very closely at an individual choice, one that I think is interesting because it involves a few different features of the Japanese language. You may have noticed that in my literal version of Gilbert's first intelligible line, he's saying, "Why just me? This awful." This is the result of my taking a bit more literally some of the connotations of Japanese parts of speech and emphasizing the incomplete nature of this line. To break things down piece by piece, the Japanese begins with the word for why, then comes the first person, then there's a particle you could pretty accurately say lines up with the word only, the subject identifier ga, and then the line breaks off, presumably continuing again with a variant of the word this that implies the speaker thinks negatively of what's being referenced. And that's it. If I were to extrapolate a complete sentence from this, my intuition would lead me to something like, "Why must I alone suffer this awful fate?" But of course, this should ideally come across as a broken sentence, since Gilbert is clearly racked with illness by this point. And I think the official solution of, "Why me, why?" does a great job of capturing the underlying sentiment. Even without literally reproducing the idea of "why just me," the existing connotations of the English phrase "why me" are able to convey to the audience both that Gilbert is feeling singled out and that he's bemoaning his fate. Arguably, this then carries forward to the next line, where the official English suggests that Gilbert is asking what he's done to deserve this, while the literal Japanese is him saying this is too much. I think both get at the core idea here, but I can see how some might consider this a stretch. Now, how are you feeling?
Oh, there you are. You're early, dear. Is anything the matter? You can always tell me. Mother will make everything better.
I thought you hated outsiders like me.
What's wrong? Anything you'd like to tell me?
No?
Oh, good. What a relief. You always were the brave one. But you can't bottle up everything inside. You mustn't be afraid to share.
Okay, now I'm curious.
What's wrong? Anything you'd like to tell me?
Sure.
Oh my, you poor thing. But don't you worry. This'll help you forget. Forget your troubles. Forget your cares.
Have you got any more of those?
Oh, what is it, dear? Are you in a bind again?
Alright, at this point we're going to get several repeated lines while we run her out of sedatives, so I'm going to take some time to start going over how well done I think this section of dialogue is. To begin at the beginning then, let's look at the first pair of lines. In the Japanese, we get an initial greeting that's customary in Japanese culture, okaeri nasai, which is a standard and expected greeting for when a family member comes home. This isn't quite as significant culturally in English, so while I don't think opening with welcome home is entirely unnatural, it feels a little like translationese. With that in mind, notice how the official translation spreads out information here. The first line's official phrasing of, "Oh, there you are," tells us this woman is aware of our presence and somewhat startled by it, but doesn't feel as if we're out of place. Then, in the next line, where in Japanese she expresses something more basic, along the lines of noting that she didn't expect to see us so soon, that's where we get the reference to our being home early. So all the important information is preserved. She thinks she's at home and her child has returned from an absence with unexpected speed, but the dialogue flows more naturally. Note also the succinct use of the term dear as a term of endearment here as well. But hang on, I think she's out of sedatives now. Let's see what happens if we ask for more.
Oh, what is it, dear? Are you in a bind again? Oh my, you poor thing. Oh, now, have some patience. Mother will make everything better.
But I don't want to wait.
Now, be patient.
Okay, guess we'll just have to be patient. While we're waiting though, let's continue analyzing her lines, this time with an eye towards any larger unifying principles. Getting back to where we left off then, after the old woman welcomes us back home and expresses surprise at seeing us so soon, she next asks us if anything is wrong. Here there's a subtle shift away from the literal that I think is important. The Japanese word used to form the basis of this question in the original, daijoubu, is one commonly used to express that all is well. Used on its own, it has a positive connotation, kind of like okay or alright in English, which is why my literal version of this line was, "Are you alright?" In the official translation, however, there's a shift away from such positive language. It's not a question of whether we're alright, it's a question of whether anything is the matter. Now, in its own right, the difference between this phrasing and the more literal one might seem like splitting hairs, but if we look at the next line, I think it's actually accomplishing something significant, because the following line of the Japanese features basically that same pattern of rephrasing. To get even more literal than my previous version of the line, the Japanese would come out to, "If you ever have anything painful," with the completion of the thought coming in the next line. But the main point here, something I think is actually accentuated in this highly literal version, is how it contextualizes the previous line of the Japanese. This woman specifically wants to know if we're in any kind of pain. Which incidentally brings me to the other point I think it's worth making about this highly literal phrasing. Because while I've chosen the word pain for the original term of tsurai, the Japanese term doesn't carry the same emphasis on purely physical agony as the English. The relevant sense of the term in my Daijisen Japanese dictionary specifically points out that it can refer to physical or psychological distress. In fact, given the rest of her dialogue, it seems more likely that the old woman is giving us sedatives for their psychological rather than their physical effects, which is why my more literal version uses the phrasing, "having a hard time." But to put all this together, what this line tells us is that the old woman is asking us if we're okay, largely because she wants to soothe us in case we're in a state of distress. So by going straight to the phrasing, "is anything the matter?" in the official English, we're getting directly to the heart of what the old woman is interested in learning. This then frees up the next line of the translation to emphasize one of the main implications of the Japanese, which is that this woman wants to take care of us. And that next official line, "you can always tell me," I think is particularly well done because it not only makes the woman come across as solicitous and eager to be helpful, but it's also a less awkward sentiment to trail off on. It's a complete sentence in its own right, not a dangling, "if you ever have anything you're having a hard time with." In other words, I think this line not only stays true to the theme of this dialogue, but it also better conforms to the expected style of English writing, and it's the economy of the previous line that makes this possible. That just leaves one line in this portion of the old woman's dialogue, and once again I think it's translated well. The Japanese here uses the auxiliary verb ageru along with the verb suru, or to do, to get across the idea that the old woman will do something nice specifically for us. Also, in referring to herself as Oka-san at the start of the line, she's invoking a cultural norm in spoken Japanese that parents refer to themselves by their family position when speaking to their children, especially when those children are young. You can see a rough equivalent in English phrases like, "You can tell mommy." Anyway, the overall idea is clearly that this old woman is speaking in a reassuring fashion to a small child of hers, trying to get across the idea that she will find a way to do something to ease their pain. I can't think of a much better English equivalent than "mother'll make everything better." So that's just one small segment of dialogue, but now that we've spent so long looking at the details, let's turn back to larger unifying principles, because I think what we've seen are some great examples of staying true to the core meaning of a given set of lines, without getting caught up on literal phrasing. Sometimes this meaning is spread across more than one line, and sometimes it's consolidated from two lines into one. Cultural nuances have been effectively localized, and the overall implications come across consistently and in character. Really, it's a great example of what I've been talking about this whole time, which I think is a good point to go out on. So, as always, please let me know if you have any feedback, and thanks for watching, everyone.